Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for this masterclass. There's quite a few of you that have joined, which is fantastic. Thank you for registering. If you're watching this on catch up as well, then thank you for taking the time to listen and watch afterwards. Before we make a start with the introductions, I'm just going to run through the house rules. If you're new to CISEC as well, then welcome. Do look at our website for more information. We run these events pretty regularly, so we normally have around 3 different kind of virtual events a month, from masterclasses, innovation webinars to ADP sorts of things as well. So do look out for our upcoming events. Just to let you know, this masterclass is obviously on the topic of threat vectors in the automotive sector, which has been quite a hot topic for us. So we really hope you enjoy it. Just to let you know that you will be muted throughout this webinar, but please do type your questions through to us using the Q&A box. Say hello into the chat as well. We've also got that function working today. Yeah, that's kind of everything from me. The session will be recorded, like I say, so do look out in your inbox for the recording afterwards, which we'll send out hopefully before the end of the week, so that you can watch on catch up if you want to, or share with a colleague. That's kind of everything from my point of view. Now I want to hand you over to John Davis, MBE, who is the Director at Pervade Software. John's going to get us started and do the introduction, and then we'll be handing over to Indy, who will be giving his presentation. So hope you enjoy it, and over to you, John.
Oh, thank you ever so much. Much appreciated. And welcome everybody to this session. It's a masterclass for a good reason. We have a master in the industry who's got some amazing information to share with us. Just before we do that, as we've just heard, I'm the managing director of a cyber company myself, Pervade Software. We tend to err on the side of threat hunting, working with the police and NCSC and what have you. So we're on that nation state side of the fence, really. And one of the things that gives us oversight of is some of the ways in which what we understand of as being the cyber threat, as a commercial, cyber criminals, malicious hackers, insider threats, etc. We tend to think of them from a commercial perspective. Actually, behind the scenes, in a lot of cases, this is happening at a nation state level. And we can track and trace really where this began. Cyber as a thing has been around since the late 80s. Really, as soon as we started to network computers, people were busy trying to hack them. But there was a wonderful project that somebody, it probably whilst drunk, came up with as a good idea to see if they could make it happen, called Project Aurora. And this was back in 2007. Now, Project Aurora was somebody who thought it would be a good idea to use some lines of code to punch into what are called programmable logic controllers. And for those of you that don't know, those are the smallest components, really, that just control whether something should be turned on or off or up or down or speeded up or slowed down. So, for example, the thermostat in your house is probably a really noddy example of that. If your house gets too hot, it turns itself off, and if it's too cold, it turns itself on. That's got a physical control in it. But if you imagine a programmed control that is punched in with some lines of code, then you have those lines of code programming what that logic controller does, and it can literally switch things on and off. So they got themselves one of these huge, great big power generators, about the size of a shipping container. And they had this generator stuck in the middle of the desert, and basically put these lines of code into this generator and punched the lines of code in while it was running. And what it effectively did was it switched the instructions from off to on and on to off. So if it was going too fast, it went faster. If it was going too slow, it went slower. And the net result was this thing was like jamming itself into reverse whilst doing 70 miles an hour, and then jamming itself into first gear, and then jamming itself into reverse repeatedly over and over again. Rather predictably, that resulted in the whole thing shaking itself to pieces, shattering itself, and eventually kind of blowing up in a puff of iron filings. This was the first time we saw lines of code causing physical harm, kinetic damage to something. And in this case, it was a power generator. Moving not too far forward from there, actually, we saw attacks being made, warfare-based attacks, on places like Estonia and Georgia by the Russians. And we saw some hacks being used there. A lot of it was about DDoSing systems to just turn off the power or turn off the controllers. And it had the same effect. You know, you could shut a power station down, or you could shut a power distribution center down with some DDoS attacks from attacks such as black energy that were in use at the time. But then the Americans trumped that completely, if you excuse the pun, by launching what became known as Operation Olympic Games, which was actually Stuxnet, which is where, again, lines of code, again, attacking PLCs, attacking those programmable logic controllers, effectively threw out the speeds on the centrifuges. And it was really cleverly done. I mean, as a hack, you just had to take your hat off to it. But effectively, they were managing to speed up the centrifuges just for about 15 minutes. And they only did it every 27 days, which is a really random time. But it meant that it was very hard to spot. And the Americans were doing this against an Iranian nuclear refinery establishment from about 2008 through 2010, when it was discovered. And suddenly everybody realized that the Americans had been doing this. But again, an example of where lines of code, this time delivered remotely, could actually impact programmable logic controllers. So where has it gone since then? Because these are fairly momentous occasions. We also saw the Russians then begin these attacks on the Ukraine. Actually, it all started back in 2014. And through 2014 and 2015, we saw them evolving from this kind of DOS using black energy into some really powerful hacking tools, taking ideas and notions from Stuxnet and putting it into their own code. And a code called Indestroyer was born out of those efforts. And Indestroyer, literally, as the catchy name implies, is specifically designed to destroy industrial control systems. And they have been weapons testing that in the, against Ukraine, really right through until 2017 and beyond, when we saw some devastating attacks. We're now watching these things play out again with industrial control systems being hit. We've seen Colonial Pipeline getting hit. We've seen library systems hitting physical systems. And of course, literally in the last 2 or 3 weeks, which proves how topical the timing of this talk is, in the last 2 or 3 weeks, we've seen the birth of Indestroyer 2, again launched at industrial systems through the Ukraine. But as with all of these things, you can't just attack one entity and it stops there. These things, like dropping a big rock into a pond, and these ripples then go outwards in waves, and all of these attacks that we see. Stuxnet hit pretty much everybody in the world, although it didn't damage anybody. Indestroyer and Indestroyer 2 have caused rampant damage around the world. And these are everything I've just described, these are industrial control system hacks. These are not going after banking systems. They're not going after people's ransomwaring people's PCs or trying to invade their privacy on Facebook. These are industrial control systems, which is when we turn our attention really to, well, where might these things strike? Where might these things do us the most harm? If somebody's going to do that, we're talking about power stations here, we're talking about nuclear refineries, but is there somewhere where we're going to feel it even more closely than that? And of course, the answer is in our factories, in our industry 4.0, a digitalized factory settings where so many of us work and make our living and manufacture things for the world around us. And also in any area where we're looking at it in mechanical devices and automating them. And that, as the name of this session today implies, leads us into the automotive industry. We're going to get an amazing talk from Indy on that any second. Just to let you know, before I hand over to Indy, we also have Neil Jarvis with us today. Neil Jarvis is a member of Cyber Wales and actually was head of IT and head of cyber at Neil, you might as well introduce yourself. I'll say you're ex of Aston Martin, but if you can say just a couple of words, and then we'll hand over to Indy, and then perhaps you'll stick around for some questions at the end, because you've got some real world experience of a lot of this stuff. Are you able to speak there, Neil?
I'm able to speak, so thank you, John. So good afternoon, everybody. I'm Neil Jarvis. I'm a recovering CISO. And former pen tester. I was head of ethical hacking at Deloitte & Touche. I was the CISO at DHL Supply Chain for a couple of years before I took on cybersecurity at Aston, ended up running IT somehow. and now I'm an independent consultant focusing on vehicle cybersecurity and from the regulatory perspective. So helping organizations meet regulatory requirements.
No, Neil, it's amazing, and thanks for joining us today as part of the Cyber Wales ecosystem. And it sounds like if we get some questions towards the end of the session today, we might well be tapping into you and your experience. But coming on to our guest speaker, our masterclass speaker, Indy, you consult businesses in this space. And indeed, not just on that technical aspects, but also on the business and commercial aspects of this, because, Neil was saying he was working for DHL, and actually they got absolutely smashed, didn't they, by what turned out to be the kill disk derivative of NotPetya that basically hit pretty much, all of these giant organizations. I know you've got some amazing snippets yourself in your talk. I'm going to hand over to you now. So please, if you could do an introduction of yourself, and then we're really looking forward to the content that you've got to share with us.
Sure, thanks, John. And it's a real pleasure to be talking today, and an honour to be invited to speak on behalf of the Chartered Institute. Just to set the context of the next half an hour or so of this masterclass, I'll do a short introduction to myself, who I am, my experience, then set the scene around the connected and automated car context, then discuss some of the current threats and their potential impact, and also some future threats that the industry faces. And then finally, what the industry should do collectively to become more cyber resilient. And this is really built upon my experience, research, and just general interest in this space. So moving on. A little bit about me. I've been in the industry now for just over 18 years, purely in information and cybersecurity. So straight out of university in roles that relate to the topics that we're talking about today, various different organizations, both on an operational side of the fence, but also in consulting, as well as running my own business. So you can see from the list of companies on the screen there where I've worked, including a couple of automotive manufacturers, having spent time both in the UK, in my hometown of Coventry, where Jaguar Land Rover are based, but also spending almost 3 years in Stuttgart. So being at the home of Mercedes-Benz, really learning how the full end-to-end manufacturing of the executive and premium class vehicles. Also a fellow of the Institute, so thanks. I'm thankful for joining last year. And currently I work for a company called Istari. Now, many people probably haven't heard of Istari. We are part of the Singaporean government's investment fund, and our mission really is simple. We want to help create a digitally resilient future for the businesses that we work with. And we recognize that cybersecurity has become almost the most business critical risk that organizations face in a highly digital and connected world. And that connected world requires a collective response. And we work in 3 ways, which is really around being an investor, so investing in cybersecurity companies, being an advisor, so helping clients understand what it is to become resilient, and also as an educator. So we run executive programs for leadership teams to really understand the role that they play from a business perspective and help them understand the cyber risks that they face. I'm happy to talk about what we do if anyone's interested offline. And also we have a range of portfolio companies that are relevant to the things that we're talking about, but I won't go into the detail of that today. So setting the context, there's around 200 million connected and automated vehicles on the road today, and I'll use the acronym CAV as we go through this presentation. And that 200 million number was an estimate from the 5G Automotive Association. And what they do see as well is that by 2024, the number of real-time traffic updates and connectivity will be possible due to a highly connected digital road infrastructure. This means more connectivity to sensors, to satellites, to cameras that are recording And by 2026, the expectation is that a more advanced vehicle-to-vehicle capability will bring about that nirvana of fully automated vehicles, and that brings that a step closer to reality. Interestingly, and as John mentioned around vehicle architectures, there's been an exponential rise in the capabilities of today's vehicles. And 40% of a vehicle's architecture now consists of electronics. And that's testament to huge leaps and bounds that have been made in technologies designed to enable that a range of solutions in a vehicle, whether that's sharing data, connecting to various systems, and providing intelligence to support automation and, as we all know, around electrification of vehicles right now. Now, the point that John raised around lines of code, I'm glad that he mentioned that, because it's an interesting stat. The typical modern vehicle right now contains around 100 million lines of software code. And it's expected to reach 300 million lines of code by 2030. Now, for comparison, a typical passenger plane, a Boeing jet, has around 15 million lines of code. So that's a huge difference between an aeroplane and a typical vehicle on the road. Now, today's vehicles contain a range of software, more than we've ever seen before, a vast number of connected automotive systems, whether that's the power, the locks, the braking systems, windows, entertainment, seats, steering, as well as a range of many other features. Now, future vehicles will become equipped with even more advanced autonomous capabilities and driver assistance systems, which then ultimately increases that complexity of a modern vehicle. So what are the threats that are faced by manufacturers and users alike? Now, in my experience, securing intellectual property, such as new designs, prototypes of models, tooling and technologies that are used in the manufacturing plant, as well as strategic plans, have always been a strong focus from the manufacturers and the design houses, because I saw it for myself in my time in Stuttgart. If you wanted to enter the site and you had a mobile phone that had a camera on it, they would take the camera away from you and super glue a piece of metal over the lens to stop you taking any photos. And it's the real world scenario. This is in the early days of mobile phones when cameras were just starting to be used. A little bit extreme, but you can understand why they wanted to do that. However, once these new vehicles are on the road, they're connected, they're what was termed as CAVs, are quite vulnerable to a range of cyber attacks. So I've written about some of these threat vectors in the past, and I'm touching upon some of these and adding more to it as we go through this presentation. The number one point, as I've just discussed, is the vehicles are fundamentally a highly interconnected architecture of technology and control systems, a range of services that are constantly being connected to a range of systems within the vehicle. That could be a gateway electronic control unit, an ECU, a telematic control unit, the TCU, with communications and sensors all embedded. Now, these services can take control of various elements of a vehicle, the powertrain, so your engine and transmission, the chassis control subnet, which is your steering, airbag, your braking, and then the body control subnet, so instruments, climate control, your door locking mechanisms, and the infotainment subnet, which is your satellite navigation, the telephone, audio and visual. Alongside these components, there are a vast range of external connections. A lot of folks aren't really aware of the number of connections. That could be an ODB port, a USB, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, GPS, as well as 3G, 4G, and 5G. And a lot of more commonly known connections that people know in the market are the Android Auto, Apple CarPlay, as well as many others. Now, what this creates is a complex connected infrastructure that could leave vehicles exposed to a range of entry points for a malicious attacker. The damage or loss of sensitive data, as well as failure of those systems, be it error in software or interception of some of that information, such as locking of the doors or the engine, or tampering of the vehicle controls in any way, as well as identity theft, are all possible risks due to this complex nature of the vehicle. The second one is an interesting new threat vector that was raised by the National Institute of Standards and Technology in the US. This is a threat vector that targets vehicles that are charging during their charging cycle. Now, this research highlighted that as an actual realistic scenario of multiple electronic vehicles, electrified vehicles being hacked simultaneously during a high wattage charging cycle, with the aim of not targeting the vehicles themselves. The vehicles themselves are a leapfrog into the power grid. It's causing blackouts. This risk, was highlighted by NIST, and they also stated something quite worrying. They said that the energy and transportation sectors have very little understanding of each other's concerns and approaches to cybersecurity. The next vector really is around mobile devices. Now, the mobile device has now become your key, but not just your key to access the vehicle, but also to control multiple functions, turning the lights on, locking the vehicle, the infotainment unit, your climate control, even to cooling the seats before you get into the vehicle itself, as well as the movement of the vehicle via a summon function. Now, mobiles and apps have long been known to be vulnerable for a range of areas: for password management or password usage, code errors, outdated operating systems, users not updating to the latest firmware, and ultimately susceptibility to malware, viruses, and just poor general practice, which could then become a leapfrog into accessing a vehicle. For example, a malicious actor may have installed an app on that device, which then could allow them access to the vehicle identification number. And once the VIN number is obtained, they could then install a legitimate app to potentially take control of the vehicle or even hold it to ransom. The next one is the human element. Automotive designers, engineers, everyone across the supply chain really needs to develop new skills and change the way they work. And this means a transformation across the entire life cycle, not just the design and manufacturing phase, but sourcing, program management, sales, after service, even down to roadside assistance. But all of those employees and stakeholders need educating on cybersecurity. And we saw a couple of recent examples on this. A Tesla employee was recently approached by a criminal gang to deploy malware across the Tesla software code. However, this employee wasn't bought into that and didn't want to take the bait. But what that does, it highlights the need to embed a strong culture of awareness, as well as controls to prevent someone that did accept a potential substantial fee to support the criminal gangs. And also, it highlights the threat to life in certain dark areas of a manufacturing network. For example, a paint spray booth or a welding machine, which are robotic and are connected to the internet. If those technologies were compromised, there could be a risk to human life of those folks on the manufacturing track. And finally, financial crime. Now, the CAV payments market is expected to reach over $636 billion by 2030. While the threat of malicious attacks and physical theft, they've been a concern for a long time. However, in my view, the common threat vector that we will see likely in the future is financial gain. Connected and automotive vehicles will have these multiple technologies that can provide payments for a range of services, whether that's paying for fuel, paying for subscriptions, tolls, parking, or even food and drink. There's a risk of that payment data being compromised either through close proximity to the vehicle or remotely. Now, the deep and dark web have already contained a whole range of vulnerabilities in 0 days, and this will only increase as more and more information is being stored on these vehicles. But what does this really mean? Some of those are real blue sky thinking of the worst case scenarios. In my view, there's a few scenarios that could transpire. One being supply chain. The supply chain, even if the manufacturers themselves are secure, the sheer amount of third parties and fourth parties along their chain of building the vehicle lead me to think that they could be compromised through a smaller provider along the chain. And this leads into a really interesting conversation that I've had recently around counterfeit chips. Now, we all know that vehicles are being delayed in the manufacturing process due to a chip shortage. And there could be a huge risk of these counterfeit chips entering the market, which then have vulnerabilities, embedded malware, or just bugs that may not be able to be fixed. And as I mentioned, the loss of personally identifiable information, more and more data being stored in these vehicles, if it's physically stolen or remotely, this could potentially lead to large GDPR fines for manufacturers. And in fact, just last week, a recent report by Kaspersky highlighted that 69 popular apps, third-party apps that are being used in the market that are designed to control these connected cars, of only 58% of these applications, the vehicle users were being asked for consent without their knowledge. And another interesting point around keyless and remote theft. So keyless entry, we see a lot of thefts of vehicles, even in my own neighborhood. You know, Range Rovers are disappearing off owners' driveways with ease. And now with teenagers and gangs alike learning how to steal vehicles on YouTube and purchase the equipment easily, is becoming a much more common route to stealing a vehicle. Now, there's a risk that future cars are could be potentially stolen remotely without physically needing to be broken into, you know, with attackers being able to disable the GPS system to avoid capture. And finally, cloud-based compromises, so and ransoms. Cloud misconfigurations are quite common, and we'll see more and more cars and manufacturers using cloud-based services for a range of activities across those vehicles. And being remotely attacked or even held to ransom raises a really interesting question. Who helps recover the vehicle if it's been disabled by ransomware or malware? I'm pretty confident that the roadside assistance companies aren't geared up to deal with a cyber attack. So who then helps in the case of a vehicle being completely disabled on a motorway? It just raises an interesting topic. Now, in my opinion, you know, these car hacks and cyber attacks is really about, you know, in the future will be about data theft more than the physical theft of the vehicle. It's much easier to monetize the data and avoid capture from the criminal gangs. Whilst there will be attacks that disrupt the physical vehicle itself, data is really what holds the most value. And these vehicles are absorbing so much data as they go about their daily lives, it just becomes a much easier target to monetize. So what does the automotive industry really need to do? You know, it's an increasingly digitized sector. It's facing a growing number of cyber threats, and everyone needs to participate across the supply chain to really understand the risks that they face. And you know, for me, there's a couple of, you know, sort of hygiene factors. Number one, it goes without saying, but you know, as a security professional, I find myself keep repeating the same message, which is ensure that you've got a strong foundation, that strong cyber posture. You know, strong, mature posture really to me means getting the people, process, and technology as a priority. You know, a continuous process of testing, practicing, and improving cycle. It's not just a do once and forget about activity. And that strong posture really includes implementing some leading technologies to ensure that both the IT, the information technology posture, and the OT, the operational technology elements, are fully secured, especially now that we're seeing more and more cloud-based systems connect to machinery and vehicles alike, both to control and monitor those services. So from an OT and IoT perspective, it's about protecting those industry controlled systems, manufacturing plants, IT networks alike, that initially, going back many years, that may not have had security built in by design. And having visibility of all of those assets with an ability to identify and remediate vulnerabilities quickly is really key. And that could mean deploying passive micro collectors with 4G or 5G connectivity to really get that real-time network asset visibility and alerting from anything that deviates from the normal. Encryption, key management to protect that data at rest in motion is also becoming increasingly important as those connected vehicles continue to collect more and more data, more personally identifiable information. And something that a lot of manufacturers are looking into, but more need to, is something that's called a VSOC, a Vehicle Security Operations Center. Much like you see in IT, but more focused on the vehicles. And such technologies in place include cloud security posture management, cloud infrastructure entitle management, which really are around providing an assessment and monitoring capability for compliance and risk across cloud platforms that connect to vehicles. Now, data is obtained through APIs that can help the manufacturers identify and remediate infrastructure risks in their vehicles, but also in their plants very quickly. And this could also include providing a view of configurations against defined and compliance standards and helping identify anything that deviates from those basic hygiene needs. And from an infrastructure perspective, these tools can help focus on access and permissions. So if you think about access and permissions from an IT perspective, that same premise applies for a vehicle. You know, it can manage entitlements, deliver a principle of least privilege, limit permissions or access to a vehicle to only those folks that are really approved to use the vehicle itself. Now, interestingly, something that was told by one of our partners is that 5G connectivity now can allow tracking and monitoring of IoT assets moving at a speed of just over 300 miles an hour. So that fits quite well with a moving vehicle. The next thing is around manufacturing quantifying their cyber risks. Now, historically, automotive manufacturers have been very, very mature at calculating losses as a result of track downtime and track outages. And that can equate to millions per hour. However, cyber risk quantification is not really adopted fully across the sector. Now, cyber risk quantification really is focused on throughout the design development processes through to decommissioning of a vehicle, assessing the security levels and components throughout that entire life cycle. And cyber risk quantification really can help ensure that the appropriate level of security controls and coverage is commensurate with identified risks and threats, which also includes data privacy assessments, which are now prescribed by some of these new standards that really focus on taking a risk-based approach. Now, those new standards really need to be embedded from the design, build, and operate processes, from the outset. And these new vehicle-specific cybersecurity standards are really taking a focus on the new connected car world in design and manufacture, but also operation. And there's a couple that come to mind. Is the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, it's UNECE, WP29, that's a cybersecurity standard. The ISO standard 24089, which is around software updates for engineering. And then finally, the ISO 21434, which is about road vehicle usage. So great standards, purely focused on cybersecurity, but they also need to be offset against the known industry standards such as NIST and ISO 27001. Now, these standards are really key because advanced technologies and the increased connectivity of these vehicles that I've talked about increase the risk of cyber attack, and also the risk of physical injury and the loss of life and the loss of data. So successful cyber attacks not only could lead to loss of financial or reputational damage, but also regulatory fines for manufacturers. Now, one thing that a lot of clients are asking me about is, do we need cyber insurance? What's our liability? And the one thing that I say is, don't make any assumptions about your potential cyber risks or what coverage you have. There may be a need to have multiple cyber insurance policies in place, i.e. for first party insurance or insurance for damages potentially around a cyber breach or an attack, but also third party liability insurance, the costs related to damages in third parties or across the supply chain or during an attack of a moving vehicle. But the key thing really is to pay attention to some of the terminologies in these policies, because there may be gaps in coverage when it comes to response or preparedness. But the key thing is to regularly review your coverage as risks evolve and as new threats emerge. And ultimately, it's about driving behavior and awareness and behavioral change across everyone that's involved. It's a supply chain to users, and really taking learning and best practice to the possible controls and processes that are needed. And on the topic of cultural change, for me, there's this is a major area that needs to be addressed, the efficacy and the efficiency of cybersecurity technologies in the market. And from a cyber perspective, as I mentioned at the start of this presentation, it's become the most critical business risk that organizations face in this connected world, and it requires that collective response. A challenge that everyone has across all the industries I face, not just the automotive space, is that products in the market claim to protect us, maybe not all working. We're seeing an increased number of cyber attacks. The cyber industry has got many great examples of technical and operational excellence. Things are working. However, the issue of efficacy is a problem of microeconomics, not technology or innovation related. And recent research has suggested that CISOs said that they knew how to assess, that they really didn't know how to assess the effectiveness of what was on offer in the market. There was no real standard approach to testing what they're being sold. Now, unfortunately, current buying behaviors don't provide the market with incentives to support an independent test or independent assurance of what they're buying. So buying behaviors need to change first. And this is where a recent initiative called the Safer Charter comes in. Now, this was set about by the former CEO of the NCSC, Kieran Martin, and the charter sets about principles that are required to support change in the industry, which drives transparency and accountability. So from the S perspective, this is about symmetry of information between the buyer and vendor, really transparent, ethical ways of engaging and ensuring that we have the right level of information of purchasing products. From an A perspective, it's assessment frameworks and practices in place that are a standardized approach. F is around the freedom of entry and innovation in the market. E is around efficacy-based assurance. And finally, the topic that I've raised, risk-based decision-making. Now, all of the above are relevant for the connected automotive vehicle industry, but also everything else. For me, this is what working in the cyber industry is really interesting. It's all about, we have a huge part to play in every industry. And I believe it's our role as practitioners and technology innovators to collectively address that cybersecurity challenge we face, especially as technology risks move into human safety as we're all vehicle users on the road. And for me, that's a real key point. And I'd like to thank you for your time today. Hope you found this webinar was of value, and happy to open up questions. Do we have any questions in the chat? John, you're still on mute. I see a question. What are the key aspects of the human element needs to be reinforced? It seems that most attacks start within the human layer of the company. So isn't this key to controlling threat? It really is. This is the human element of security is a topic that I've held close to my heart for many, many years. During my time at the Information Security Forum, I worked with a team to write a report around the ABCs, the awareness, behavior, and cultural change of the security side. Now, it's really about enforcing through and education through engagement, not through the old ways of the security team or people being seen as the policing force. It has to be made relevant, and it has to be made clear to users of any technology of why security is so important to them. Only then can you really drive that value, drive that message home.
Yeah, sorry about that, Indy. I was desperately trying to find my mute button and failing dismally. There was also a question there from Adib Rashid. He was asking about known APTs in this space. Are there any nation state or APT actors that we're aware of that are renowned for playing in this space?
Yeah, that's an interesting point, and it actually raises a real world example of a client that I've worked with in the past. Now, this is a well-known manufacturer, and they've developed joint ventures, and actually all of the manufacturers that I've worked with that I know have developed joint ventures with certain nation states, which then have allowed those nation state companies to connect to their networks, to obtain their data, and with very limited security controls in place. Now, I won't mention any of these nation states, but some of the companies that come from those that come from those parts of the world are pretty much a proxy for the government. So what it means is it's a leapfrog in a fairly open door policy then to allow that data to be transferred across.
Yeah,
so those APTs, yes, it might be nation states. There are criminal gangs that are also interested in the data, but my view is it won't be the vehicle. The vehicles will continue to be stolen no matter what. The technology will improve. There'll be mechanisms to reduce the amount of vehicles being stolen, and I think the manufacturers still have a big role to play in this, because we're still seeing vehicles disappear and end up in container ships and end up in really remote parts of the world. And I firmly believe it needs to start with the manufacturer, because it's ultimately their technology that they're providing to their users.
I think there's two that leap to mind. As you say, you're being very careful there not to mention names or to name names, but we do know that there are some Chinese APTs that are infamous for stealing IP as well. So people that are attacking the cars themselves, as you say, is a potential problem in the background, because if they can get into the cars, if they can disable the cars, if they can take the cars and move them secretly, then it's a huge threat. But the IP that went along with the creation of these cars, the American president, a former American president, was famous for saying that it's been the largest transfer of wealth, if you try and quantify the IP that's been taken during these long-term hacking episodes, where information and IP and secrets have transferred across from one nation to another is a big issue. Because of course what it also does is it leads us into those gray market areas where parts can be manufactured and flooded back into a marketplace, but coming from a completely unregulated environment.
You're right, John, and that I think you've gone a step further with the point I made around chips. So other components that may have vulnerabilities or malware embedded from the start. So it may go completely unnoticed because it happens to be a smaller component along the chain. It's not necessarily the ECU. It could be something else, which then allows it to provide data that could then be used against the user. Or but for me, it really is those long-term APTs that are there to grab as much information as they can. And I think I mentioned to you a few weeks ago that I've been involved in a few of these incidents where nation states have been in organization, completely not to cause any damage, to steal as much data as they can about plans, about this is one example is oil and gas. Where is the next sort of super underground well of oil that they could tap into, and getting there first and drilling and obtaining the drilling rights before anyone else. And it's the same with vehicles. We have seen an example of manufacturers trying to take nation states to court over the copying of certain vehicles. And actually, I think this one I can mention is Jaguar Land Rover. The Evoque was copied by a Chinese manufacturer, and I believe they were successful in that court case. But what happens when it comes down to some of the lower level components, which in themselves can be a huge market, just financially, really, not to cause any disruption to vehicles, but to just undercut the OEMs.
Absolutely, and raise the prices of cars from our end, of course, because the car manufacturers will lose vast amounts of money in the spare parts that go along with their cars in the life cycle of their cars, and if they lose that to the grey market, then we feel that very strongly in our at price points. Another area that we see from an APT perspective, of course, is North Korea, who are they're shoring up their entire economy with ransomware. Effectively, they're the biggest income to North Korea as a nation is ransomware money, which is a frightening statistic. But this idea of hitting manufacturing plants, because those are the ones, if they can shut down some manufacturing, that costs companies vast amounts of money every second, every minute, every hour that they're shut down. But we haven't yet, I don't think, seen any real ransomware attempts at individual vehicles, have we? Is this something that you've come across?
There are some really smart, and I can't claim to be anywhere near some of these smart hackers out in the industry who have tested this and proven it to be a relevant vector. And they've shut down, I believe it is a Jeep and several other vehicles. And actually, there's a young lad, a teenager that set his own company up because he managed to do this. And now he consults to the manufacturers because he's proven that these vehicles are susceptible to risk, and he's got a known methodology. So I'm just seeing a question there that, for example, could a vehicle be disabled remotely by the manufacturers with the right authority? They could. It just leads into a particularly grey area. There are technologies in place, and I mentioned some of the ones around the cloud infrastructure entitlement and cloud security posture management. Because if these vehicles are, and most of the vehicles are connecting to various systems within the manufacturer or the vehicle SOC, if needed, there's an opportunity for them to remotely disable the vehicle, because that access and the infrastructure entitlement applies to a vehicle, because ultimately it's a moving computer. So if I can remotely disable an iPhone, I should be able to remotely disable a vehicle. There's no difference. There is a risk of human life if it's moving, and if it's a thief that's in the vehicle at the time and it causes an accident and there's injury or loss of life, it just goes into a bit of a grey area. If there's an opportunity to slow the vehicle down and stop it safely, then I can understand that.
It is an interesting one as well, because of course, I mean, there was a big fuss, what was it, about 3 weeks ago with the Bluetooth hack on the Teslas. And actually, truth be known, that's not a new thing, right? That was all over the papers in 2020, and everybody said, oh yes, we'll get it fixed straight away. And here we are 2 years later, and somebody's still attacking Teslas with the Bluetooth. But that Bluetooth capability leads us into the vehicle control with an iPhone. You walk in there with the app on your phone, and that's what's controlling the entire vehicle. You don't even need a key card. So if you can get into the vehicle, then what can you do inside the vehicle to cut yourself off from defense mechanisms, etc., if the car actually believes that you're the right person because of these Bluetooth hacks? So this is very, very current. That's a good question from Dave Kerford there, because this is not just from the manufacturer's perspective of safely shutting these things down, but actually the fact that we are seeing these tens of thousands of pounds worth of cars just being cracked open as if, as you quite rightly say, Andy, it was an iPhone. So yeah, interesting question there. I'm just rolling back up the chat there to Barney Wright's questions about the human elements. And what human elements do we need to be focusing on here, given that most attacks start with that layer 8 issue that we talk about? What are your thoughts, Andy?
So yeah, the insider threat is a really interesting one, whether that's by misconfiguration, by misadventure, or if they have been compromised. And I've seen examples of this in organizations where rogue employees have been placed into an entity to steal IP. So it's an interesting cultural point as well. I've worked with certain companies, in particular in Japan, who do not believe that's the right thing to be doing. They believe, they trust their employees, they shouldn't monitor them. But we all know that there's always a risk of the human element causing an attack vector, whether that's malicious or not. So there are multiple technologies out there to monitor employees, to monitor the human element of things that can be applied. So whether that's we trust you, but we still need to have these controls in place. And I think a lot of employers and especially with COVID, we've seen, and I've had clients say this to me, Indy, that there's people that never in a million years would we have trusted to work remotely, but now they have to. So now we have to find new ways of ensuring that they deliver, they do the right thing, but stop them doing something that we don't want them to do.
Yeah, no, that's true. Yeah, very true. And actually that question's being built on there in terms of, can we put all of this responsibility and load it all onto the manufacturer, or even the retailer? Should we be looking to the the consumers, the people that buy these vehicles and actually sit there and drive these vehicles and enjoy the benefits of these vehicles. You know, how much can we push onto them to maintain safety, security, and in this case, pertinent to this conversation, cybersecurity? You know, what can they be doing from a consumer perspective? Because it's too easy to push it onto the manufacturers, isn't it?
Yeah, I agree, and thankfully, I maybe it's because I have a lot of friends and family members. You know, they tend to ask me questions. Oh, I'm selling my vehicle. I have all of my personal data in here, my Spotify list, the destinations that I have as home, or family members, all of the my phone numbers and my contacts, as well as my email. Should I be concerned about this? How do I go about ensuring that this data is deleted before I sell it and pass it on to another user? And I think that education is there, and we're seeing and I've seen a huge increase in cybersecurity in the news. Go back 18 years, there'd be nothing, and now we're seeing more and more on the news. Yeah, given a lot of it is fear, uncertainty, and doubt, but I think I have to give credit to a lot of the typical users, because people have become more tech savvy. They're more aware of what they should and shouldn't do, mainly because it's driven by their mobile phones. The mobile phone is a highly complex computer, and people are more aware of what they should and shouldn't do if it's lost. So we have to give some responsibility to the users. The manufacturers need to make those users aware of points or areas that could be at risk. So it's a two-pronged approach.
No, I think so. And just to bring Neil in here, Neil, did you experience? You've seen the flavour of the questions that have been popping up in the chat, the ones we've responded to. Did you see issues like this cropping up when you were head of cyber at Aston Martin as a specific use case?
So the specific use case which triggered everybody to pay attention was the Vasilek and Miller Jeep hack in 2015. That's where they remote controlled a Jeep on the freeway with a wired journalist in the driver's seat.
That's right.
So this galvanized UNECE Working Party 29, who set regulations for vehicle safety, and there are something in the region of 170 regulations in place. The two most important ones that the automotive are currently worried about are 155 and 156. So they've got wonderful titles: Uniform Provisions Concerning the Approval of Vehicles with Regards to Cybersecurity and Cybersecurity Management System is 155, and 156 relates to software updates. As of the 1st of July this year, all new vehicle types need to comply with at least 155 and very probably 156. So they have to demonstrate they have a cybersecurity management system. They have to demonstrate that the vehicle has been built with cybersecurity in mind and has operational cyber in place. So type approval for a vehicle, for those people who don't know, think of it as an extended MOT. It includes the crash testing, it includes lots of other things, but essentially it's there to validate that the vehicles are safe. And the type approval authorities perform this task. So the manufacturers are focusing on this at the moment, and they're working really hard to get things in place. So that's for new types. And then come 2024, all vehicles that are in production will need to comply with this regulation. And this is a regulation, so an regulatory authority in country can stop a car being sold if it doesn't comply. It's not worldwide, it's generally Europe, Japan, and a number of other countries, but there are equivalent legislation which is takes inspiration from the UNECE in other countries.
Yeah, it's interesting actually, because you've leaned into a question by Mike Parker here about is the industry looking at suitable benchmarking standards, and you've kind of opened that up there by saying there's hundreds and hundreds of them. I think that's a bigger problem, isn't it, Indy, where it's not a question of whether we have a standard, it's the fact that we've got hundreds of standards that makes it almost impossible for organizations like Aston or any of the companies that we've dealt with here to get a handle on this. It's if you give them too much governance and too much compliance to tackle, it just gets in the way of the whole process. What are your thoughts?
Just to be clear about the regulations, they all apply to something different on the vehicle. So regulation 48 relates to indicators. Regulation 148 relates to lighting. 157 relates to automated lane keeping systems. So it's not, if you're complying with WP29 regulations, then there is one regulation for everything you need to comply with. But your cybersecurity management system, you could pick NIST, you could pick ISO, you could pick ISACA, you could pick ISF. That's where it's a bit more open.
It's really interesting, because that's on that factory side. I love the fact that individual components have got their own compliance as well, because this actually leans back into the point you were making, Indy, about really 100 million lines of code.
300 million.
And going up to 300 million. I mean, but that initial attack that I spoke about right at the start that hit that power thing, that was 138 lines of code. It's less than one of those little dancing cat gifs, and yet we're looking at vehicles here where every component in it is separately compliance driven, etc. But that's a redonkulous amount of code. What hope is there of being able to kind of get a handle on this?
John, can I actually challenge that number? Because
you can, but we've got 4 minutes left. So
that number comes from a Wired article in 2012, where the 100 million lines of code was quoted. An average car ECU, based on open source analysis I've done, is about 3,000 lines. One of my team created an Arduino ECU emulator. I think it's got 50 lines of code. And if he annotated it, it might have 100. And the average number of ECUs in a car is about 80. I could see how it would work if you took every bit of the ecosystem in. So every Linux server that supports the car, at roughly 14 million lines. Any Windows server there, 40 to 50 million lines. But I really struggle to. I'd love someone to demonstrate that here are all the ECUs, here's all the source code, and it does add up to 100 million.
I think actually, I mean, the point here is, I mean, even the numbers that you shared with us there, if you're talking about a few thousand lines of code and there's 80 of them, you're instantly up into the hundreds of thousands, and you start getting into hundreds and thousands and millions. Either way, it's a big problem, and it's something that individuals can't tackle. How is industry tackling it, and where are the risks? The risks exponentially grow the more lines of code there are. So however many lines it actually is. Perhaps this leans into Mohammed Chowdhury's question here that I've seen on the chat box as well, where it talks about the main challenges of digital twins. Is this something you've come across, Indy? This notion of digital twins in the industry?
I'm not sure of that term, but for me,
I'm assuming it must be something to do with, twinning the control, or twinning the controls or the vehicles themselves. If I can grab the entire fingerprint of a car, I can create an identical car.
I see.
I mean that there are two of them driving around that have got identical, digital DNA, for example. Which actually, this is where this more lines of code makes it harder to do that, right? In theory.
That's right. But for me, just finishing up on the last point, really is around the thing that I saw over the last 10 years or so is the disconnect between the manufacturing plant and the IT, and that historically has always been, we're the manufacturers, we know what we're doing. We're not having any downtime. You can't test, or do any penetration tests because of whatever reason. But you mentioned about the standards. Manufacturers have long been used to multiple standards for various elements of the vehicle. So it's a cultural change that needs to be done, and education of why these additional elements are now being included. But I think knowing how adaptable the automotive industry is, I don't see it being that big of a problem for them to quickly educate themselves and understand why.
Yeah. Well, we've hit 5:30. I get a sense that the conversation could go on and on here. It's obviously a really popular topic, you know, either out of a sense of interest in this space, or you know, recognizing the importance of it for the future. You know, where's this going? I think also it's a bit of a microcosm for the broader IoT industry as well. You know, this is a way of putting a whole bunch of IoT issues into something that we all know and love, which is a vehicle. So, you know, by putting it into a set context like this, it does sharpen the mind and focus the mind on these issues. But a lot of them are just right across the whole IoT spectrum. But it's great to be able to drill down here and get into the detail of the information that you've given there, Indy, on your slides. And that was a really nice kind of romp through. There was a good structure to it. There was a nice flow to it, and I'm sure everybody's got a huge amount out of the presentation itself as a masterclass, and the questions themselves. I mean, you know, obviously people have been not only paying attention but have concerns as well, which they've turned up with, which hopefully have been assuaged by that. So thank you very much, Indy, much appreciated. Neil, thanks for joining us and adding in some of your experiences there. And thanks to the Chartered Institute. I mean, these kind of masterclasses are things that, you know, these are topics that need to be brought to the fore. They need to be presented out to members of the Institute, you know, people who have joined the Institute of Information Security Professionals or haven't joined yet. Those are the two categories. You've either joined already or you haven't joined yet, because, you know, they are the kind of the first and currently only chartered institute that specifically looks at security, and we need to support that and help it to grow so that we've got a single point of reference that we can all rally around for masterclasses like this one, I think. So thank you very much, Indy. Thank you very much, Chartered Institute. Much appreciated. Thank you very much as well to everybody that took the time to turn up to this session and hopefully enjoyed it. And I think we're going to have some more masterclass sessions moving forward as we go on, because you know, this one has been such a great success. I think it's been a great template for future masterclasses and different topics. So that's it from me. Jazz, I don't know if you've got anything you want to chip in with at the end here from a Chartered Institute perspective.
We do just have an event that I'd love to shout out before I go. We have an innovation webinar coming up at the end of the month, which is the 30th of June between 4:30 and 5:30, and that's all around automated incident response. So if you like the sound of that, then please do either go to our LinkedIn or drop an email to events@sysec.org, just registering your interest, and we can get you signed up to that. Other events after that, then we've got a couple of masterclasses, one on the 6th of July, that's a morning session all around the threat landscape, and another one on the 20th of July as well, which is another afternoon session, which is called Cryptojacking, Cash is No Longer King, which comes from one of our corporate partners, Dianac. So again, if you like the sound of those, we'd love to see you attend. But again, just a massive, massive thank you to yourself, Indy, John and Neil for being here this afternoon, and everyone that joined. Have a lovely afternoon.
No, thanks everybody. Much
Thank
appreciated.
you.